you're watching Initiative Africa. My name is Asha Sompert. Welcome to your weekly magazine featuring Africa on the move through smart innovations and initiatives that work. Today we take a look at the conflict in Sudan and we also assess the progress in the fight against malaria. But first, here are the main highlights on our show today. A look back at a political and human tragedy that has been left in the background. In Sudan, the conflict between the army and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces, RSF, continues to destabilize the civilian population and the economy. This deteriorating situation is closely monitored by one of the leading specialists in the region. Marc, Emeritus Research Director at the National Center for Scientific Research in France, is our guest today.
Today, the situation seems to be at a standstill. There's a kind of balance of power between these two groups, and then the Sudanese people who are watching, who are not directly concerned, and who are simply victims.
Autodidacts, traditions, creativity and technological prowess. It's a winning cocktail for the emerging African animation industry.
I too dream we broadcast Cameroonian cartoons on our television. Ones we produce in Cameroon or even anywhere else in Africa.
A shrub and a herbal tea, that's the recipe to help fight malaria in Africa with Artemisia. We head for the Congolese educational forum that promotes it.
Did you know there are areas where there is no pharmacy? The idea is to promote this plant while we develop a drug, because the ultimate idea is to manufacture the drugs locally.
It's a love story that goes way back to the 50s. Africans have been interested in animation for decades, but it wasn't until the years 2000 that filmmakers from the continent, such as Nigeria's Adamu Waziri, improved the quality of productions with the first African animated feature, Bino and Fino. Since then, the passion has been revived in the younger generation with many self-taught creators and the emergence of independent studios across the continent, from South Africa to Kenya and Nigeria, not forgetting Cameroon. That's where our Douala correspondent Maxime Farel-Bunia went to see a screening of filmmaker Jules Kala Eyongo's new film. Take a look.
Full house at this movie theatre. Many cinema lovers came to discover a new cinematographic creation, Mboa Matanda, a short 13-minute animated Cameroonian feature which highlights a traditional sporting discipline practiced to resolve a century-old conflict between two large village communities living side by side in the Mboa Matanda town. Leaving the French Institute of Cameroon, there was a general feeling of astonishment and satisfaction.
Well, first, I'm pleased because I'm very attached to culture, and it's a great innovation to see animated films representing our culture. That's important in a globalized world where there's a culture shock, and preserving our originality is important.
Indeed, the animation industry in Cameroon is still developing, but in a few years it will be able to produce some great films.
This short film gives a boost, like a new painting, to the African film industry, forced to keep up with the new demands of modern art. Behind this masterpiece is a young team led by Julie Kala Eyongo.
Je suis réalisateur depuis plusieurs années.
I've been a director for several years. It's a childhood dream. I started in television as a journalist and even a radio director, but in the film industry...
Et même à la radio, réalisateur à la radio. Mais pour les questions de cinéma,
I've been a director since 2019 after graduating from the Institute for Training and Conservation of Audiovisual Heritage, an animation training school.
L'Institut de formation et de conservation du patrimoine audiovisuel de la CATV.
It was at this very training center that the idea of producing this animated film was born, encouraged by his professional mentor.
Alors nous avons notre enseignant, monsieur, je vais dire son nom, monsieur Vinucha.
We had a teacher who asked us to make a cartoon about a story from our villages.
Des histoires de notre village en fait. Et moi, fan de films de baston,
And in my research as a fan of fight films, I discovered that we had a traditional sport called bezoar.
De mes origines propres. Et un jour, j'ai découvert que nous avons un sport traditionnel qu'on appelait le bezoar.
Which is where I got the idea to create a drawing on this subject.
Qui va parler du bezoar.
Bezoar is the traditional wrestling practiced by the Sawa community highlighted in the short film. So, to make his dream a reality, Jules surrounded himself with young collaborators who worked day in and day out to produce this animated film using sources of inspiration and the right equipment.
Mon rôle dans la création du film d'animation, c'est...
In creating an animated film, I'm the animation director, and my role is to make sure that our idea is technically possible.
Soit concrète à la fin. Comme logiciel, on utilise Photoshop,
We use Photoshop, Krita, Sketchbook and Blender.
Sketchbook, on utilise aussi Blender comme logiciel jusqu'à présent. Bon. Mon rôle est illustrateur.
I'm an illustrator and I design backgrounds and art concepts. It's a new experience for me to enter this professional environment.
D'entrer dans ce milieu professionnel. Faire les études dans le domaine d'animation ne signifie pas qu'on est bon.
Studying animation doesn't mean you're any good at it. Some people learn, and they're not as good as the self-taught ones. So I want anyone with a gift for drawing to rub shoulders with those in animations and prove themselves.
Ceux qui sont dans le domaine d'animation et à faire leurs preuves.
However, as with any business sector, there are plenty of hurdles.
De faire déjà des films de très bonne qualité.
The fact there are high quality and excellent quality films means there are people who dream of producing animated films, but making a living from them is usually difficult.
Je rêve également.
I too dream we broadcast Cameroonian cartoons on our television, ones that we produce in Cameroon or even anywhere else in Africa.
En Afrique aussi.
The animation industry in Africa is currently enjoying a remarkable boom, with talented filmmakers creating innovative films that reflect local culture, history, and traditions. Cameroon is actively participating in this development, with a growing industry closely following the success of leading animators from Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Egypt, South Africa, and Mozambique. In 2019, Netflix acquired its first African animator, and foreign companies in the sector are increasingly interested in recruiting African animators.
As I mentioned in the headlines earlier, current events in the Middle East threaten to overshadow the crisis in Sudan, and yet it is a country at the crossroads of two cultural heritage whose stability is vital for the continent. Let's talk about it now with our guest Marc Lavergne, a leading expert on matters related to this region. He explains what's at stake in the conflict and why mediation efforts have repeatedly failed. He revealed to Laurence Soustrasse and Thierry Schiller some of the key elements to understanding this complex crisis. Almost 6 months after the start of the fighting between the Sudanese army on one side and the paramilitary group RSF on the other have passed. Now, how do you analyze the situation in Sudan today?
Aujourd'hui, la situation elle est apparemment bloquée.
Today, the situation seems to be at a standstill. There's a kind of balance of power between these two groups, and then the Sudanese people who are watching, who are not directly concerned, and who are simply victims of this appalling confrontation between two groups who are seeking to destroy themselves, who have no intention of negotiating anything or sharing power, even though these groups were very, very close. Finally, we mustn't forget that the rebel forces, the rapid deployment forces, as their name suggests, were trained by the army to be the army's auxiliaries. And so today, they want to get rid of the army and take all the power. And the army, for its part, is the heir of the 30-year regime of Omar al-Bashir and his Islamist movement. Behind it wants to do like Omar al-Bashir, but without Omar al-Bashir. We got rid of a man who was under arrest by the International Criminal Court, and it was his deputies and colleagues who pushed him aside to take power in his place. To continue along the same lines, so in the end, we have a conflict that is not ideological in the sense of popular representation or anything close to that. Neither side has popular support, but their weapons are different, so there's a balance of power. with a division of territory too, which seems to be somewhat frozen today. In the end, it's very difficult for the army to impose itself, and today, these rapid deployment forces are supported from outside. The army is also supported from outside, making the conflict increasingly difficult to resolve.
And yet, all attempts at mediation seem to be failing one after the other. How can you explain it?
I think that
the lack of understanding of the problem posed by stakeholders, whether regional or global, who are trying to determine what their interests are in this matter. In the end, that's the only guide. That's why there are neighboring countries supporting the army and other countries supporting the rebels, who are not rebels in the strict sense of the word, since they were supporting the army. So, in reality, we have a conflict over power, personal ambitions, and access to resources. But there is no control of the state, no vision for the Sudanese state and neighboring countries. We can name them. There are countries that support the military, like Egypt, for example. Then there are countries that support the rebels, the auxiliaries, like the United Arab Emirates. Then there are other countries like Saudi Arabia that aren't quite sure which side to take. These countries have all tried to initiate mediation or at least dialogue, but so far nothing has come of it, and neither has what was set up by the United States with Saudi Arabia in Jeddah at that very beginning. There were ceasefires lasting a few days, but they didn't lead to negotiations because this is an existential conflict for both sides.
What about the African Union's attempts?
We could
have hoped for a lot from the African Union because in Addis Ababa, there are highly experienced diplomats who have led their countries and who know both the groundwork, which is important, and of these kinds of conflicts. We could mention Mohamed Faki from Chad. There are others too, and then there are former presidents of Nigeria and South Africa, people who have both charisma and support, but they themselves have not managed to tackle the subject. Sudan is an African country, but is also an Arab African country. It's a country that has always been a little on the fringe. It wasn't colonized in the classic sense of the word, since it was a condominium between Great Britain and Egypt from 1898 until 1956. As a result, Sudan has a strong sense of independence, a feeling of owing nothing to anyone, a feeling of independence that persists to this day, with a political, economic, cultural, and religious elite that is completely autonomous from both the great liberation movement of African peoples since the 1960s and from the Arab League founded in 1945, to which Sudan also belongs like other African countries.
From the Sudanese Western perspective, the role of sanctions now appears rather arguable, as it is often the case. Are the sanctions imposed by the United States and then the European Union useful in taking action against the warring parties?
I think they are pretty marginal. Sudan is a ruined country. It was before this crisis, with an appalling debt, and there's also a desperate popular situation on the street.
La reconnaissance de l'État d'Israël
The recognition of the State of Israel in November 2021 led to the increased support from the United States, the World Bank, and international funding agencies. All this has been locked up again, and now we are trying to get our hands on personal fortunes, for example, but all this has no impact on the lives of the Sudanese people. Either way, because the country is completely devastated and ruined, and any fresh money that could be brought into the country would immediately be diverted by the military forces present.
par les forces militaires en présence.
And today, what we can see is that the democratic transition launched in April 2019 has completely failed. All the political parties, unions, youth groups and professional groups that took part in this democratic transition have been completely wiped off the map. In other words, we are not dealing with a civil war. Civilians are not involved in the war. They are merely its victims. It's a conflict between two sides. So I would say that sanctions or the removal of sanctions have little impact because there's no leverage to absorb new money and inject it into the economic machine. Relaunching factories, reviving agricultural production, reviving the mining sector, all these are impossible in a totally uncontrollable security situation.
Totalement incontrôlable.
Welcome back to the second part of our show. Malaria, one of Africa's most dreaded diseases, continues to cause severe damage. But there's hope. The World Health Organization has confirmed that 12 African countries will be allocated 18 million doses of the RTS-SAS01 vaccine over the period 2023-2024. The vaccine has been tested since 2019 and is deemed safe and effective. Until now, to counter the disease, Africans have turned to Artemisia, a bush that can be cut several times a year and from which herbal teas are made. Some African organizations have even taken it upon themselves to promote the virtues of this plant. Such is the case of Susten Masamba Kolela, founder of the Agria Loango Educational Farm near Pointe Noire in Congo. Our journalist Jean-David Miamli and the cameraman Brice Kinhu visited the farm.
We are at the HQ of the educational farm Agria Loango on the Indian Point near the seaside town of Pointe Congo. It's here that Susten Masamba Kolelas decided to promote the cultivation of Artemisia, a medicinal plant. The goal is to help the Congolese to understand and take benefit from this plant to fight effectively against malaria, one of the most feared diseases in Congo in particular.
Did you know there are areas where there is no pharmacy? The idea is to promote this plant while we develop a drug, because the ultimate idea is to manufacture the drugs locally, but we're not ready. We don't have the means. So, while waiting for drugs to be produced locally, we are offering this alternative solution, which is Artemisia herbal tea.
According to WHO, in 2019, 94% of cases of malaria and death related to this disease are recorded in Africa. With 41% of Congolese living on less than $1 a day, according to the latest figures from the World Bank, access to healthcare is difficult. Artemisia then appears as an alternative and not a rival to conventional medicine.
There is often this misconception between conventional as opposed to the traditional medicinal approach that we offer. Artemisia is a choice that is given to Africans. The conventional, in other words the drugs, or the natural approach, which is herbal tea. There was never any question of the producers of Artemisia saying, don't take this, don't take that. Freedom is a very good thing. To live is to choose.
To carry out his project, Susten Masamba built the Loango Educational Farm on 6 hectares. Representative of the House of Artemisia in Congo, he also aims to transmit to young people the benefit of working the land and the benefits of organic farming.
Here we are at the Agria Loango Educational Farm. At the same time, the HQ of the company Artemisia Congo. There are several activities here. We have Artemisia, where we organize both training about Artemisia, its cultivation and production. Then there is the educational farm component, where we receive schools that bring children for nature and discovery outings. Also parents who bring their children as well, and adults who wish to learn about gardening tips. We also organize training in agroecology in particular, composting. So basically, this is what we do.
Either way, Artemisia enthusiasts say they are satisfied with the product. Artemisia, I think that's a good thing. It's a good medicine that I discovered a year ago through friends who told me about it when I was sick. Once I took it, I was completely relieved and still continue to take it. I think it's a great product to recommend to people. All in all, mastering the culture of Artemisia is a major goal for Sosten Masamba. Hence, regular training sessions on the cultivation and consumption of Artemisia.
How do you grow Artemisia? I dig the hole first. I put the manure. Mixed with manure, with this compost, this is how we plant Artemisia. And then I water the plant. The Artemisia looks like this, in a packet that contains 40 grams of herbal tea, dried Artemisia leaves. The dosage is indicated on the back, how to prepare herbal tea. To put it simply, as we do in rural areas, you unpack the content, you divide it into 7 parts. Why 7? Because you're going to take it for 7 consecutive days. Each portion is equivalent to 1 dose. You put in an infusion, a liter of boiling water at 100 degrees with large bubbles. You remove from the heat, you take the potion, you infuse, you cover, you wait at least 15 minutes. You filter, and the liter is to drink during the day.
Sosten Masamba, who proudly claims the status of peasant, continues to cultivate his garden, proud to have turned his passion for agriculture into a profession.
We now turn our attention to the world's second largest river after the Amazon, the Nile. Could the Grand Renaissance Dam sow discord between Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan? And what does the future hold for equitable water sharing in Africa? To answer these questions, we welcome back our guest, Marc Lavergne. Let's hear what he has to say. We know that the country is one of the protagonists in a conflict concerning the Renaissance Nile Dam. Can you tell us what it is all about?
The dam is the biggest barrier in Africa and is intended to help develop Ethiopia and neighboring countries. This dam has been somewhat blocked because there's an agreement on the management of the waters of the Nile, which excludes Ethiopia, but which serves as a legal table, I would say, for funding from the World Bank and others. However, only China has agreed to finance this dam. The Ethiopians have all paid. In other words, I've seen people in Ethiopia, women giving their jewelry, men giving part of their salaries, civil servants, they weren't asked for their opinion. So from 2011 to last year, we managed to build this dam and fill it with water. But the problem is that the dam is holding back flood waters from the Nile. Every summer, a flood irrigates Egypt since the time of the pharaohs. And then the Egyptians were afraid of having their water taken away from them. And they consider it vital because they live largely from agriculture. There are 110 million Egyptians and about the same number of Ethiopians. So afterwards, we can discuss the details. But negotiation was difficult because everyone said, I'm building the dam at home, so it's none of your business. And the others said, no, since Herodotus, Egypt is a gift from the Nile. It's a matter of life and death for us. So we've got to talk, and we are against this dam. We are going to bomb it. They even went so far as to say that the Sudanese are in the middle. They were divided because, on the one hand, it can protect them from floods, the regulation of flood waters, because from one year to the next, floods can be more or less important. Khartoum is at the confluence of the Blue Nile and the White Nile. And when the Blue Nile arrives, it sweeps away building everything in its path. And because the city has grown so much, there's been a lot of building on the banks, which has led to human tragedy.
Putting aside the disagreements between these countries, what will this Renaissance Dam achieve in terms of water and energy regulation?
So if it's a dam that produces energy and only energy, it makes no difference. You can't keep the water behind the dam, otherwise the dam will collapse. So the water has to pass through and supply a turbine and electricity that will be used to build railroads and factories. Ethiopia has major development projects with China behind them. The Chinese have built a railroad from Djibouti on the Red Sea to Addis Ababa, the capital. They have a great interest in developing this workforce, which is the cheapest in the world. An Ethiopian worker earns $25 a month. That's a lot less than in Bangladesh or even less than in China, of course. So there's this big project. Ethiopia is also the only African country that has never been colonized. It's the headquarters of the African Union, so it's a driving force, a model country that aims to be both different and a model for the whole of Africa.
And do you think that the pressure around the dam, the alliance between Egypt and Sudan, can define a danger for the stability of the region, or has the conflict in Sudan completely pushed the dam into the background?
It's true that the conflict in Sudan, insofar as there is no longer a government, there's no longer anyone to express a Sudanese position on the dam. Let's just say that there are border problems between Ethiopia and Sudan, and that the Sudanese army is rather close to the Egyptian army. So it has tended to oppose the regime in Addis Ababa. The Ethiopians might be leaning towards the rapid deployment forces, but all that is very much up in the air. For the moment, Sudan is out of the picture, I would say, in this battle, which is also tending to calm down because the roadblock has been built. Everyone knows that it's a given and that no one is going to support Egypt if it was to bomb the dam, which would be a human tragedy. After that, it's up to the technicians. I'll say that the diplomats and the scientists. We mustn't forget that in Addis Ababa, I visited a think tank of technicians interested in the development of the entire Blue Nile. The Egyptians, Sudanese and Ethiopians working together every day. Nobody talks about it. In the suburbs of Addis Ababa, to draw up economic and social development plans for the entire Nile basin.
So African riverside countries are in favor of a more equitable sharing of water, or a revision of the 1959 sharing agreement, which was very favorable to Egypt and Sudan as far as the Nile is concerned. Do you see a new equality of water in Africa?
So there are two things. Firstly, the riparian countries, where the African countries of the wilds now that were not independent in 1959. So they say we've never been asked for anything, and they signed declarations in Entebbe, Uganda in 2010, reiterating that they wanted to be around the table and discuss with Egypt, because the big problem is always Egypt, which is the downstream country at the very bottom. And so often the downstream country has nothing to say. So if we look at Turkey in relation to the Tigris and Euphrates, it's Turkey that designed all the dams it wanted because it was upstream. It dried up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Syria and Iraq, and nobody was able to say anything. This is the opposite case. So the game is on for the African countries bordering the Upper Nile, the White Nile, and the Equatorial Nile. That's the question. So what's next for the rest of Africa? There's the Senegal River, which was developed in a model way, I think between Senegal, Mauritania, and Mali a long time ago. So there's still a whole field of water management on the African continent, with climate change and population growth thrown in for good measure. And we need expertise in this area, technical expertise and legal expertise, because international water law is a little deficient up to now. In Europe, we have examples. The Rhine and the Danube are the subject of agreements between the European countries, but on a local basis.
Well, that's it. Initiative Africa is over for today. You can find the interview with Marc Lavergne as well as our programs on our website, africaonair.com. And of course, don't miss the chance to follow us on our social networks and to like, share and comment with the hashtag Initiative Africa. And don't forget to tune in next week on the same channel at the same time for a new episode of Business Africa. Have a great week. Goodbye.